what I love about what you said and what I think is so true is that what's really amazing about teaching musical theater is that it's made up of all these different parts, and it has music and it has lyric and it has orchestration, and it, depending on the show, it might have spoken word, and it has staging and casting and costumes and lights and set and design and all the marketing stuff around it and all the economic issues and the biography of all the creators. So there's so many different ways that you can come into studying a musical, and I just think my preference, I'm very interested in musicals in their cultural moment, but that's only one of an infinite number of ways to approach the show, which is why it's actually so cool to hear about how you're teaching as well.
Now, is that a Broadway musical teaser or what? Okay, before I introduce Stacy Wolf and you get to hear all of these Broadway musical scholarly analyses from Stacy Wolf, I want to remind you all, we have an in-person Halloween party on October 29th. The Ivory Tower Boiler Room presents with Pen and Brush, our artistic collaborator, our Halloween Literature Bash happening on October 29th from 7 to 10 p.m. We are going to have food, drinks, book giveaways. We're going to be playing some literary games. We're going to play some trivia games, giving away signed book copies from authors here in the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. We're giving away Ivory Tower Boiler Room merchandise. There's going to be a Halloween selfie wall to take pictures with you in your costume. Dress up as your favorite literary character, literary author, anything literature universe inspired. I'm going back to ancient Greece with my costume. So go to ivorytowerboilerroom.com to get your tickets. They are $20 and you get your food, your drinks, all the games. You're going to definitely go home with a giveaway. That's to be certain. So can't wait to see you all there. I'll be joined with Mary and Kim, and some of our interns will be there. So see you all in Manhattan on October 29th. It's at Pen and Brush in Chelsea, Manhattan. So it's going to be a Halloween artsy party. Okay. And then if you haven't yet, please follow us on TikTok and Instagram at Ivory Tower Boiler Room. You're going to see all of our video teasers. We have a lot of steamy pictures from our not safe for work discussions. You know, I get into some really steamy erotic discussions with our authors here and artists. However, I have to say this Broadway musical episode is definitely a safe for work episode. I'll put it that way. And I thought, why not start with some music? Why not start with some Dreamgirls? Because that is my favorite musical. Here is the Queen, Miss Cheryl Lee Ralph, who just won the Emmy for Abbott Elementary, singing Dreamgirls.
Every man has his own special dream, and your dream's just about to come true. Life's not as bad as it may seem if you open your eyes to what's in front of you. We are dream girls, boys, make it happy. Yeah, we are dream girls, boys will always care. We are dream girls will never leave you. No, no. And all you've got to do is dream, baby, we'll be there.
Hi, welcome back to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I am so excited with today's discussion because not only do I get to interview Dr. Stacy Wolf, who she said I can call her Stacy now, who is America's foremost scholar on musical theater. Not only is she the professor of theater at Princeton, she also has written books that I cherish. I first got to know Stacy when I was at my local Long Island library, and I had her book Changed for Good in my hands, A Feminist History of the Broadway Musical. I know we'll talk about it, but when you have Wicked on the cover of a book, it's going to be an exciting read. And then Stacy actually just came out. Well, 2020, I'm going to consider it just came out because of the pandemic. but just had her book published, Beyond Broadway, The Pleasure and Promise of Musical Theater Across America, that we're really going to deep dive and dig into. Also, I have to talk about some of her recent publications. They're exciting titles like The Hills Are Alive with the Sound of Music, Musical Theater at Girls' Jewish Summer Camps in Maine, USA. Also, The Feminine Mystique Goes to Broadway, Housewives in 1960s Musical Theater. One of my favorites because of the line that she chooses from Mame. Her essay Will Always Be Bosom Buddies, Female Duets, and the Queering of Broadway Musical Theater. That was actually published by Gay and Lesbian Quarterly in 2006. So, Stacy, welcome to the Ivory Tower Boiler Room. I am so excited that you are here with me.
Thank you, Andrew. It's so wonderful to be with you. And I'm a huge fan of this podcast and really thrilled to be on it this time.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Well, just the range of me reading what you've published. And I think Stacy and I'll give you the behind the scenes. We've been having a really exciting conversation before I hit record.
We have. It's true.
Yes, we're Broadway enthusiasts. And I was talking about the literature and Broadway musical course that I taught. And hopefully some of you out there are my students. So hi to the students. And even with your teaching, it seems like you must bring so many different Broadway genres or even critical lenses of how to teach the Broadway musical. So do you feel that your publishing and your teaching sides come together in a certain way?
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, I feel probably the same way you feel, that I'm so lucky and fortunate that I get to teach musical theater. Because I think in a lot of universities, it's not considered a serious subject. I think the way you've taught it in conversation with the source material is super interesting. And when I teach musical theater, it's always in conversation with US history and culture. It's always both reflecting and shaping US history and culture. The seminar that I teach every other year on Sondheim's musicals actually lives in our American Studies, the Efron Center for the Study of America. So our American Studies program, and that class is explicitly about Sondheim's musicals in conversation with the moment of their creation, and then future revivals of those shows and how they're in conversation with that moment. So I think just being able to teach musical theater as a serious historical, cultural, literary based, multidisciplinary art and entertainment form is so amazing. I feel so lucky that I get to do that. And absolutely, all of my teaching is in conversation with my own work. And Changed for Good came about because I wanted a book for my students. I wanted something that they could read that would take us through the history of the musical from a feminist perspective. I think there are many different ways that the history of the feminist history of the Broadway musical could be written. And I think that that's what so many academics are doing now. So I kind of laid the groundwork with this book. And then now there are many, many other ways, many angles, many different methods, many different approaches to take to thinking about musical from a feminist, and I would say for my work, always feminist and queer go hand in hand. So when I wrote that book, it was very much developed as I was teaching these shows and thinking about these shows and trying to make sense of these shows and thinking about different musicals in different decades. And that continues. All the work that I've done, everything that I've published about Hamilton came out of teaching Hamilton, or I would be thinking about Hamilton and then send it back to my students and hear what they had to say about it. And even this summer, I was teaching a summer school class for a few weeks, and we did Beauty and the Beast, which I had never actually, I think I actually maybe had never even seen it, or certainly never taught it or studied it. And so I really got to dig into that musical with my students, and they were so smart about it. And we watched actually a pretty good bootleg community theater production of it and talked about it. And it was really amazing. And so yes, that's kind of a very long answer to the teaching and the scholarship is always in conversation with each other. And I think I'll just say one more thing about this. In terms of Beyond Broadway, I was very much motivated to write Beyond Broadway because I wanted to tell the stories of my own and my students' experiences growing up doing musical theater, not in New York or not in relationship to the professional Broadway musical scene. And very, very early in my research for Beyond Broadway, I remember having dinner with a bunch of Princeton students, maybe 15 or 20 of them, sitting around a table. And I just said to them, okay, how did you come to do musical theater? And they were talking about summer camps, and they were talking about shows that they did when they were in third grade. And they were talking about going to see a local show. And very few of them were New Yorkers. Very few of them had seen a Broadway musical until they got to Princeton, and Princeton took them to New York to see something. So I wanted to, so in that way, that wasn't a formal teaching situation, but that was just being in a room with young people and wanting to share their stories, which I'm sure, I mean, you must feel this all the time in the classroom, that the things you learn from your students, you want to share and learn more about. And that's just why it's so great to be a teacher, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, there's so much you offered there, Stacy. I first can't believe that you get to do a Sondheim course. That's exciting. That's actually, if I like the literature in Broadway musical, there's literally, this is what I love, is how much it speaks to culture. And I love that you're approaching this from the cultural historical perspective. Even like that you have that publication about housewives and the 1960s. And you could just do a whole course on that with genre. And you could do a course on the horror musical, or that Sondheim gives you so much. So I'm just curious, when you do approach Sondheim, do you tend to focus on like just one of his specific genres, or do you try to incorporate a lot of the Sondheim? Like, it doesn't matter if it's an Into the Woods, a Sweeney Todd, a Follies.
Right. Yes, we do a different show every week and think about that musical in conversation with that moment. So when we study company, we look at publications that were in the media in the late 60s about marriage and about bachelorhood and about gender, and think about New York City and what was going on in New York City in the late 60s. So we're always thinking about what was happening at the time. And not to say that there's not a direct cause and effect relationship between context and artwork. There's an incredibly complicated, indecipherable, beautiful relationship between context and artwork. But certainly context and artwork are always in conversation. And Sondheim was of his time, and George Firth writing company in the late 60s, I mean around in 69, 70, was of his time. So we're always thinking about that aspect of it. And that's only one way to approach it. I think I have a lot of friends and colleagues who teach courses on Sondheim, and they're much more focused on, say, the music and a musicological perspective, and how exactly is the music put together. And we talk about music in my class and we approach it musicologically, but our stress is much more in terms of how it resonates with issues of the time in terms of gender and class and race and sexuality, and also always thinking about how do you do it now. So yes, we would think about Company in 1970, and also the Marianne Elliott revival of Company and what that says in our contemporary moment, and how this story and how these characters can resonate in different ways in the 21st century with a female Bobby, and so on. So I think what I love about what you said, and what I think is so true, is that what's really amazing about teaching musical theater is that it's made up of all these different parts. And it has music, and it has lyric, and it has orchestration, and it, depending on the show, it might have spoken word, and it has staging and casting and costumes and lights and set and design and all the marketing stuff around it and all the economic issues and the biography of all the creators. So there's so many different ways that you can come into studying a musical. And I just think my preference, I'm very interested in musicals in their cultural moment, but that's only one of an infinite number of ways to approach the show, which is why it's actually so cool to hear about how you're teaching as well.
Well, also, I took my parents to see the Marianne Elliott Company. We saw it right before it closed. Not right before, but we saw it like 2 months before it closed. The staging was incredible. First of all, I'm a huge set design kind of conceptual person in the audience. When that curtain came up on the orchestra, I was excited. I love seeing the orchestra. I think more musicals need to have the orchestra. I just saw Into the Woods. Loved that the orchestra was on the stage. I still am surprised that Phantom doesn't have the orchestra on stage, except in the concert version, which I prefer better than when I see it on Broadway. But so you saw, I'm assuming, the Company revival.
I did.
Okay.
I didn't see it in the States. I saw it in London. I think, I just wanted to say one thing that I think is so interesting about you saying that you don't see the orchestra in Phantom. I think that is partly due to the theatrical conventions of the late 1980s when that musical opened, which were all about this huge machinery and fancy technical effects and chandeliers coming down and helicopters coming down in Miss Saigon and the big turntable in Les Mis and all the things that were, and Cats, and Evita and those late, well, Evita was earlier, but these late 80s mega musicals. And I think that was so much of a moment where the orchestra, well, first of all, the orchestra played through. So it was, once the show started, the orchestra was going and did not stop. But it was a moment where audiences, or at least the producers, believe that audiences were not so interested in seeing the labor of the musicians. They were much more interested in seeing this very cool machinery and spectacular effects and lightning and thunder and all kinds of water and fog, and that was much more interesting scenographically than the moment we're in, where I think certainly since John Doyle invented actor musicianship, and with more and more shows, I'm thinking of Come From Away, where the players are on the stage, and The Band's Visit, where a lot of the players are also the actors, and with Encores, what you were saying about the Into the Woods, that Encores is a series that's created to honor the music of the musicals. So for Encores productions, the orchestra is always on the stage and always visible. And it's great that when this production went to Broadway, or is going to Broadway, it is on Broadway. Wait, Broadway. It's on Broadway now, right? Yeah. Right. It just got extended. That they would keep that they would honor how that production was created, and that you need to see the orchestra. So I think I love that you say that, because I do think that audiences now, we want to see the musicians, we want to see the players.
That makes sense. Like Chicago was, the revival was from Encores.
Yes, where you see the musicians.
Yeah, and it's been going since the 90s.
Forever.
I love it. Yeah, that's a show where it works, in my opinion. Well, you brought up the machinery, and talk about something that's the complete antithesis, in my opinion, is a Chicago, where it's the choreography, it's the acting, it's a true triple threat musical. And I feel that it's something I'm drawn to because I love dance musicals. I love Chorus Line, even Kiss Me Kate, I guess you could call in certain sections. Guys and Dolls was a big dance musical. And I'm kind of waiting for that return. I'm like, okay, what's the next, triple threat musical?
Yeah. Would you consider Hamilton a big dance musical?
That's an interesting question.
There's a lot of dance in Hamilton.
Yeah, I guess so. I think when I'm so nostalgic for big choreographed razzle dazzle numbers. So I guess in the traditional chorus line sense, no, but you're right, in the movement, yes, definitely. There's a lot of specific gestures and specific parts that each character has to hit when they're, I guess Six in a way too could kind of has done a lot of movement choreography.
Yeah, there's a lot of dance in Six.
Yeah,
But you're right that they're not kind of set choreographic experiences the way really every dance is in a chorus line, because chorus line is a book musical. So when the songs happen, they happen in a much more contained way, and the dance explodes and it does its thing, and then it goes away, for people to talk, just like in Chicago or in Guys and Dolls or these other
yeah.
shows. Yeah.
Well, not because I want you to hit every hot button issue, because I know when I bring up Funny Girl, there's a lot going on. But to talk about a book musical, very traditional book musical, amazing overture. I mean,
Amazing overture.
amazing. I saw the revival with Beanie Feldstein. I actually am about to get tickets for Leah Michelle.
Uh-huh.
I was saddened that the orchestra is not on the stage, even in the overture, because I saw Gypsy, which again, thank you, Stacy. See, this is why Stacy is the foremost musical theater scholar, because Gypsy, the revival with Patti LuPone, was also encore. So now that makes sense to me why they brought the orchestra out at the beginning, and then they brought them to the back and put the curtain down in front of them. So like it can be done to have the orchestra
sure.
at the beginning for the overture and then hide them. So I was kind of surprised Funny Girl didn't show the orchestra.
The orchestra is in the pit for Funny Girl,
Mhm.
right? I mean, kind of in a traditional orchestra pit.
Yeah, they're in a traditional orchestra pit, which
Yeah, well, at least they're not down the street in a room somewhere.
that's true. Wait, is that actually happening?
Oh yeah,
Ooh.
I'm trying to think specifically, but there are a number of musicals where, especially with small orchestras, small pits, where they are in a different room, they're in a basement, they're down the street, and the actors just see them on the television screen, where the television screens are set on the mezzanine level. Yeah, I mean, I feel now that even if the orchestra is in the pit and you can see the hands of the conductor, that feels like a luxury to me.
Hmm. Yeah, well, and I'm now getting flashbacks to seeing the conductor on. I know exactly what you're talking about. So for those who, you know, aren't like Stacy, who's involved in so much musical theater knowledge, or if you've never been, I think, privileged to have a live orchestra as a actor. Um, I remember I was in All Shook Up. Shout out to the Broadway Pittman Theater in Pittman, New Jersey, a very nice community theater, which Stacy goes through a lot of community theaters and beyond Broadway, which are so important. I agree, are the heartbeat. We'll get into all that. But you're right. The conductor, even if they're on the stage, usually there's a little video projection or a monitor, video
A
monitor,
monitor, yeah.
monitor. And you can see the conductor, and like you're kind of trained to look for it once in a while, depending on the number. Um, but there's just something about having a live orchestra.
It's so
I've
true.
always loved a live orchestra. Yes. When it's canned or just they're playing the CD, the soundtrack, it's not the same. Yeah.
It's definitely not the same. And I think
Okay, hold on to that question because we'll be right back. But first, a word from our sponsor. The Ivory Tower Boiler Room is so happy to welcome Broadview Press as our official sponsor. Broadview Press is an independent academic publisher in the humanities that produces high-quality, pedagogically useful books for use in university and college classrooms. They publish in the humanities, mainly in English studies, writing, philosophy, and history. They always publish with an eye towards diversity, so there is a strong list of titles from women, people of color, and other authors from marginalized groups. In the summer of 2022, they launched their new Broadview Anthology of American Literature, which increases diversity in the classroom because it rethinks the American canon and breathes new life into the American Literary Survey. It's actually been called, quote, the new gold standard in the field. I love using Broadview Press text in my own classroom at Stony Brook University. I can't wait to use the new Anthology of American Literature when I have the opportunity. And for all of you out there, Broadview Press has given us the official code Ivory Tower for 20% off site-wide on broadviewpress.com. Again, that is code Ivory Tower for 20% off.
Just I know we actually have been talking all about Broadway shows, but I think one of the things that I really loved when I was researching beyond Broadway, which is, as you say, about community theaters and high school musicals and summer camp shows, was visiting high schools and watching those orchestras rehearse. And they were often kids who were also in the marching band and really incredible musicians. And I just loved seeing these kids who were in the marching band and kind of brought all this like football enthusiasm or participating in this sports event in the fall to participating in the musical in the spring. And I loved watching them rehearse. And one of the things that I write about in the book is how at some of the schools I visited, because the orchestra in the pit was the marching band, they often did not have strings. They had brass, they had woodwinds, they had percussion, because these are the marchers. And so the teacher would actually rent from MTI a track with strings. And so they would play the track on the computer, from the computer into the sound system. And then the students, who were the musicians, would play their live part on the oboe or the clarinet or the trumpet or the trombone or percussion. So you would have a combination at the show of this taped professional orchestra for some of the tracks, and then the live students playing. And I think that one of the things that was really fascinating to me in my research was to learn about the industry of enabling musical theater production and the ways that Musical Theater International, which is the biggest licensor of musicals, all the different kinds of products they create to enable production in, say, a high school in the Midwest that has a phenomenal marching band but does not have a string program. And so I think to me, it's very interesting, because some might say, well, you don't have a string program, so you can't play live, you're going to have to get the tape. But they've made it to accommodate what a school may or may not have. And obviously it would be it's not impossible to play a score of a musical with no strings, but it sounds better if it sounds better if you have a cello and a violin. So I think that's the licensors, which play a big role in my book, are fascinating to me, because they are a for-profit industry that at once makes a lot of money from all these amateur shows and enables these amateur shows, partly through the licensing. That is, you cannot do a musical without licensing it. Hence the recent debacle with Hamilton.
Yes, please speak about that.
Oh my goodness, do not do that. For so many reasons. But so you have to get permission from the licensors, and they also enable production in so many different contexts on every imaginable different scale and in so many different ways. So it's a really fascinating industry that I think a lot of people don't pay attention to, don't really know how the licensing industry works, and just think of them as the people who say yes or no, or how you get your scripts, or whatever it is that they're doing for you. But it's a fascinating part of the industry and the whole ecosystem of musical theater, both professional and non-professional.
Yeah, and I love how you walk us through that in Beyond Broadway in your intro. Especially Stacy has this whole moment of talking about Disney theatrical and the profit behind the licensing, which is just really bringing us behind the curtain, and how it became this whole mode for Disney to approve community theaters to put on their productions, that it helps Disney with their branding and the marketing and keeping, say, Beauty and the Beast alive in the press and The Little Mermaid. And it makes so much sense that they want, outside of the New York City metro area, they want these musicals to be getting airtime, to be played by all different levels whether, like you're saying, it's high schools or even middle schools, right? And then there's student editions of certain musicals. Like there's the student Grease. I mean, I remember like we had the Grease student edition for my middle school when I was Kaniki, and there's certain lines, there's certain words you can't say, and
That's
but,
right.
right. Also, I know Rodgers and Hammerstein is very notorious for being one of the maybe not strictest, but you can't do anything with editing. Like you cannot touch the script. It's pretty locked in with Rodgers and Hammerstein. Is that correct, Stacy?
Well, I think for all licensors, they're pretty locked in, as they should be, because it's intellectual property. And I think even though when we are working on a show, it feels entirely new to us. When we're doing The Sound of Music, we feel like no one has ever done The Sound of Music before. Or when you're playing Kaniki, you feel like no one has ever done this before until you. You are creating the role. It is wholly original. But there's a long history of these shows, and most importantly, composers and lyricists and librettists created the shows. So it's very important to do the product, which is what it is, that was originally created. I think that Rodgers and Hammerstein got a reputation for being really strict because Rodgers and Hammerstein musicals were so popular for many, many years. And I think it's more over the years that there are so many more musicals to do, so many more contemporary musicals to do, that I think all of the licensors are quite strict about their product. When you were referring to the school editions, one of the things that I write about in the book that was also absolutely fascinating for me to learn was the history of the juniors, the history of the Broadway Junior series that started in 1996 with our friend Stephen Sondheim, may he rest in peace, and Arthur Lawrence, may he rest in peace, who wrote the libretto for Gypsy and for West Side Story, as well as other plays. They were worried about the future of musical theater in the mid 90s, and they went to the offices of MTI and visited with Freddie Gershon, who was then the president of MTI. And he had been a music producer for many years and is completely visionary, brilliant man. And they were worried about what's happening to the repertoire and why aren't people doing our shows anymore. And part of it, but in the mid 90s, was that their shows were 2.5 hours, and a lot of them were very wordy, and a lot of them were very difficult. There were a lot of reasons that people might have been challenged by doing Sweeney Todd in the mid 90s, or high schools wouldn't want to do it, although I guess maybe everyone always wants to do Sweeney Todd. That's not a good example. But anyway, Gershon had the idea to create 1-hour versions of their musicals. Wow. And he said, let's start with Into the Woods, because the Act One stands alone. And that launched this entire industry, which now accounts for a healthy percentage of the licensors' profits, the school shows, the school editions. And after MTI developed a number of these Broadway Junior shows, then Disney, around the same time, a little bit after, Disney, who creates their own junior shows, started creating these kids editions that were even shorter. And then Rodgers and Hammerstein and all the other licensors also created school editions or junior editions. And so now all of them have these shorter versions, or like you said, the swear words are cut out or the sexuality is toned down a little bit. And they're adapted to be, the songs are shorter, the keys are transposed, and they're cut to work for kids and to work in a school day. So that's another really fascinating part of the industry that I think people who've grown up on the juniors, like your age and younger, never knew a time when the only musical that you could license would be the 2.5-hour version of The Sound of Music. Or whatever, the 2.5-hour version of Grease. And so that's another really important part, again, of this I use the word ecosystem of amateur musical theater, really important player, these junior shows.
Yeah, well, and I think what's so interesting too is I'm kind of curious, especially since I'm from New Jersey, and I remember even being in South Jersey, there's MTI they had the mile radius of something. If something is on Broadway, and you are within the 100-mile radius, all I know is it was usually the cutoff was like where I lived. So we weren't able to do whatever was currently on Broadway. Do you feel that there's more or less pressure if you're, say, in the New York City metro area and you're a community theater, a high school, that there's more pressure because of that Broadway locus than there is, say, in a Texas or California, even because you're separated from Broadway? Like, if basically families can get to Broadway easier, do you think that their communities, there's more pressure on what their theater system looks like?
Wow, that's a great question. I'm not sure, because I think that every community, even where I live, 60 miles from New York City, I feel that the community theaters in this region and the community theater that I wrote about specifically in Beyond Broadway, which is a community theater that lives at that's housed or performs at Mercer County Community College, so very close to where I live. That theater and the many, many community theaters in this region thrive as their own, I'll use the word again, as their own ecosystem. And they're always in conversation with Broadway because that's where the repertoire comes from. As you say, that's where the repertoire originates. If you're going to do Guys and Dolls, it started on Broadway in 1950. But I feel that there's so much life and energy within a community that that community could still be relatively close to New York City and still be its own thing. Yes, many of the audiences who come and see shows at the Kelsey Theater that I wrote about, or see high school musicals in my region, can go to New York and can get to New York. But that's an entirely different experience. Are they more sophisticated theater goers? Maybe. Are they more knowledgeable theater goers? Maybe. But there are also regional theaters across the country. There are touring houses across the country. You can live across the country and still see a production of the touring company of Fun Home, the touring company of Hamilton, the touring company of Legally Blonde. And I think that, I don't know, my perspective is too East Coast New York theater saturated, but I feel that in my travels, I was all over the country, and everywhere I went, there was a vibrant theater scene. And also because of YouTube and the internet, there's so much that you can access, even if you don't physically make it to Broadway, legal or not. You want to see a show, not in real life, you can see it on YouTube. You will find it on YouTube. You can see anything you want. So I also feel like the knowledge of the repertoire is so much more expansive than when I was a kid and all there was a cast album. And you would try to figure out what a show was based on the cast album and the pictures inside of the LP. And that was all you had. Now it doesn't matter where you live. You can see a production of fill in the blank because someone has illegally turned on their phone in the theater and captured it for you. So I think that you can definitely see things. I did want to say something about the question of being within the radius of forbidden productions, because this is definitely one of the things that, as much as I admire and respect the licensors, this is something that infuriates me. I do not understand why a Broadway revival of
Into the
Grease,
Woods.
Into the Woods, should in any way impinge on a high school doing Into the Woods in Cherry Hill, New Jersey.
Yeah.
To me, that is ludicrous. It is, to me, if a high school does Into the Woods, it's going to make more people want to go see that Broadway production, not fewer. People will see it in the high school and want to go see it. I do not understand at all the rationale behind these rules. And at some point I will have to investigate it further. It's definitely on my list of research projects that I need to follow up. It wasn't front of mind when I was working on Beyond Broadway, but it is something that I don't understand. And I feel, considering how sensitive and aware and thoughtful the licensors are, I really do not understand the economic reasons for that. There probably is one that I don't know about, and I look forward to learning about it. But right now, I think it's ridiculous.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and I think something that really comes through when all of you out there listen to Beyond Broadway, read Beyond Broadway, basically get your hands on Stacy's Beyond Broadway, and Changed for Good. But especially in Beyond Broadway, I love you have this whole moment about how parents, siblings, your neighbors who would never be theater goers traditional, or you don't think of them as the Broadway enthusiast. But say even where I am on Long Island, they see that Susie, their daughter, is going to be in Little Shop of Horrors. They're going to go support her. And I saw this all the time growing up in summer theater. There's a theater called Mainstage that does summer theater. Shout out to them. They're amazing in South Jersey. But just to see all the families come support their children. And a lot of them are probably not going to go to Broadway. And that wouldn't be their first experience as Broadway. It's cost. We know how costly it can be. But to pay $5 and see their child, I love those moments. So, like, can you talk about that, Stacy? Because I feel you really bring up so much of those first-time theater goers and why it matters that they know those people in their community theaters or summer theater.
Yeah, thank you. And I love all the examples that you're bringing up, because it's introducing me to more theaters that aren't that far from me. So it's great. And one of the things that I argue in the book is that local and amateur musical theater feeds Broadway, because it creates all of the artists who work on Broadway. It creates all of the audiences who go to see shows on Broadway. And as we've been discussing, it supports the licensors. And I also argue that local musical theater supports the local and feeds a local community, not only because the arts are good for us, but because, exactly as you say, people show up to watch their neighbors, their friends' kids, their kids' parents, and everyone else work on the show. And one of the things that I witnessed frequently from the participation side, when I was hanging out at community theaters, and this wasn't just in New Jersey, this was pretty much everywhere I went, is that someone would be at a rehearsal just waiting for someone to finish. So you go and your kid is in the show and you're just waiting for the kid to finish rehearsal, and someone says to you, oh, could you go and pick up this prop, or could you go and move this there or something? And before you know it, you're designing a set or building a set or designing lights or calling a show or doing something like that. And I found that very moving, how people would get involved in, especially community theater, just kind of standing around or being there. Another thing that I found very moving, particularly about community theater, was the intergenerational aspect of it, and being in a space and being at many, many rehearsals where there were children and adults working on shows together, and like little kids and elderly senior citizens working on a show together. And that's really amazing. We don't see that very often in our culture, where someone very young and someone older are working on a project together and moving in the same direction. So I loved that too. And I think you're exactly right. I mean, Broadway is ridiculously expensive. And even seeing a touring company production, I mean, if a show comes to a big touring house, the tickets are still going to be quite expensive. But I think to get exposed to the repertoire and have the enjoyment of seeing a musical and seeing the child of someone you know, or the parent of someone you know, or your neighbor who you didn't even know who was involved in theater in a show, is really great.
Yeah, I love those stories when, like, you learn that your volunteer firefighter is playing, I don't know, is in Guys and Dolls, and he's nicely, for example. And I love that energy. I love when I was in theater. I mean, I always knew I had this passion, and I kept up at lessons and doing all dance lessons, and knew that I really wanted to eventually springboard into something. But it was also wonderful to be with fellow high schoolers who were on the football team or on the cheerleading team. And
Yeah,
it was enriching their lives. I think that's the power of theater.
absolutely. I could not agree more.
And now a message from the Gay and Lesbian Review.
Hello, listeners. This is Stephen Hemrick, the publisher of the GNLR, here with a special offer just for you. For those of you who aren't familiar with the GNLR, let me provide a little background. The GLR is a bi-monthly magazine of history, culture, and politics that publishes essays in a wide range of disciplines, as well as a slew of reviews of books, plays, and movies, and a number of special features such as artists' profiles and the popular art memo column. Each issue brings you consistently intelligent, lively, thought-provoking articles focused on a unifying theme and brings together the leading minds on the topic. You won't find a lot about the latest dating fads or fashion trends, though you might find articles about online dating as a social phenomenon or the gay influence on 20th century fashion. For example, the theme of the current issue is Queens and Kings, and it features an article by Andrew Holleran about Truman Capote's relationships with glamorous women, the women he called his swans. Now for the special offer. When you subscribe, you'll receive a free copy with any print or digital subscription. That's 7 issues instead of 6. Visit glreview.org. That's glreview.org. Click subscribe and enter promo code ITBR for your free issue. And as an added bonus, you'll receive online access to all archived issues of the magazine.
One of the things that surprised me when I started talking to people at the theaters I visited, because a lot of the book, as you said, is about my observing auditions, board meetings, rehearsals, and performances. So a lot of it is my own participant observation of what was going on. And a lot of the book is interviews that I did with people. I did hundreds of interviews with people and got their stories and heard their experiences of working on these shows or being in the audience. And when I visited community theaters and talked to people, I assumed before I got there that everyone working on a show would either be on their way up or their way down. So they would either be a young person who aspired to get to Broadway or someone who had been a professional artist of some kind and maybe was raising a family or wasn't successful on Broadway or kind of was coming down. And that was not true at all. Very rarely would I meet someone who was on their way up or their way down. Everyone I met at some point had done theater or sometimes had never done theater, didn't start doing theater until they started doing community theater. And they were accountants and they were doctors and they were firefighters and they were stay-at-home parents and they were teachers and they were students. And one of the scholars that I quote in the book is a sociologist named Robert Stebbins, and he coined this idea of serious leisure. And he talks about how there are people who engage. He does not write about theater, but because very few sociologists write about theater, but he talks about how people engage in leisure activities with such utter seriousness that we can't really call it leisure. We have to call it something else. It's work, but it's work that people enjoy. It's work that people choose to do. And that notion really helped me to understand what happens at a community theater, because people go to work all day, or they go to school, or they're home with their kids, or they're doing whatever they're doing. And then at night and on the weekends, they go to the theater and they work. They labor. They're putting their bodies and souls and hearts and spirits into making a show. And often it's pleasurable, and sometimes it's frustrating and it's hard and it's tiring, but it is still considered a leisure activity, a hobby, but they do it with complete and total seriousness. And I thought that was a really helpful concept to think about how community theater operates and why it's so important.
Yeah, and the summer theater, actually, Mary, who does the True Crime and Academia series here, we knew each other. We grew up together since kindergarten at the summer theater, Mainstage. And Mainstage's whole purpose is to enrich, to empower. I mean, the different children who are part of this camp, who don't all live in the same socioeconomic community. They have different religions and races, and that is so important to me, is what a summer theater, that it's not just about, I mean, yes, a few of us really we saw ourselves in theater for the long term, but so many now I know have all different professions, and we keep in touch, and they found a voice. And I think to me, that's so important. And that comes through in everything you write in Beyond Broadway, is just seeing how each of these communities are all just trying to empower that community. And it's groundbreaking. The work you do, Stacy, really is groundbreaking, because I think it makes so much sense and we all see it, but to actually have it written down and to have these anecdotes and experiences preserved is so important. So,
thank
you for doing that.
Thank you so much for saying that, Andrew. And also thank you for sharing the observation about kids from all different backgrounds coming together, because I absolutely do think that theater is such a rare and amazing place for people of different races, ethnicities, socioeconomic backgrounds, genders, sexualities, and everything to come together and make a show. And I think, and what you say about the purpose of this theater to empower, absolutely, it is to empower. And you just said it so beautifully. So thank you.
Well, I've been reading your work too. So there's some words in my mind. So I know we're almost out of time, but if you will, for just, few more minutes, I'm not going to hold you long, but if I can just get your hot takes, not like I'm putting you under literally in the boiler room, but if I can just get a few of the questions that I know as scholars we don't always like to answer, but I am sure there is a musical that, if you had any musical, which musical would you just constantly put on replay?
Well, that is a very hard question. And it's always, I almost always feel that it's the musical that I'm teaching or the musical that I'm writing about, or and I think I have fairly eclectic taste. So I would have to say right now it would be Rodgers and Hammerstein's Cinderella, because I'm co-writing an article about it, and they're replaying the 1997 Brandy Whitney Houston version on August 23rd, which I can't wait for. And they're going to have different some of the creators and performers talking about it. But it is such a beautiful score, and it's also a really interesting show because it's the only show that Rodgers and Hammerstein wrote for television, and it had 3 different versions in the 50s, the 60s, and the 90s. And then it actually did not go to Broadway until 2013 with yet another production that was a beautiful revival. But it's just a gorgeous score that somehow keeps giving. I feel like the Cinderella Waltz is one of the most beautiful pieces of music Richard Rodgers ever wrote. And somehow this story that you would think would be completely anti-feminist, and it is kind of the basis for the most horrifying, passive, inducing stereotypes of women, also is about the imagination and kind of about a girl who gets herself out of a bad situation, and about women who bond to empower each other. So there are definitely some hidden feminist messages in there that my co-writer and I are trying to mine. But I would say right now I'm way about Cinderella. What would you say is yours? I mean, I wouldn't say always and all time, but for now it's Cinderella.
Yeah, I would say if I had to constantly listen, or the one I turn to the most, I would say Dreamgirls. There's something about Dreamgirls.
Love Dreamgirls.
Yes. And for the musicality, I just love how well they got the genre of the Motown sound into the solo singer with Dina, and then this whole Diana Ross kind of bio that they're trying to do without infringing on copyright.
So
I think Dreamgirls to me is the one that I love to listen to the sound. But a chorus line I will always turn back to. Fiddler on the Roof. I mean,
Yes.
yeah,
Oh
there's so
gosh, I
many.
love these shows. Yes,
I
they're
know.
so
But
good.
and now which show, I don't want to say that you would throw it away forever, but we would put it far back on the stage and like, you would let it gather some dust, maybe dust it off once in a while, but you're not that keen on talking about a lot.
Well, and we kind of started by talking about a show that I did not know until I taught it this summer, and that was Beauty and the Beast. And I have to say, I find it fairly irredeemable. My students ripped it to shreds. They had no use for it at all. And last year, I don't know if you heard about this, but they did a production at the Olney Theater Center in Maryland that was directed by Marsha Milgram Dodge, and it featured a plus size queer Black woman as Belle and an actor who walks with a peg leg. He lost his leg to cancer to play the Beast. And all the clips that I saw from that production and everything I read about it suggested that maybe that turns Beauty and the Beast on its head, to have these very non-typical actors playing these roles. So I think they're going to bring it back again next December, and I would really love to see if it changes my idea of Beauty and the Beast, because all the productions, all the bootlegs that I watched of it to prepare for my class this summer, I never saw it on Broadway, and I just think it's horrible.
Yeah.
But that's why I really want to see this production, because I think she's a brilliant director, and these actors are fantastic and amazing, and I would love to see how they tell the story in their embodiment.
Yeah. Yeah. That reminds me of, I really want to see this new Legally Blonde. Like, I hope this Legally Blonde I actually really love the revival, but not the revival. Sorry. I loved when it first came out. I saw it.
Yeah.
It's one of those, next time I'll have to have you on and we'll talk all about movie musicals, because that opens
Oh
up
yeah.
a
Let's
large
do
can of
that.
worms. But I love Legally Blonde. I think they did a good job with that musical, but I'm curious. I love, again, kind of going against type. I like what they're doing
Right.
with these
Right.
musicals. So, but yeah, the musical that I will let collect a little dust is Cats.
Oh my goodness. See, that wouldn't even make it. That doesn't even make it onto my mentionable. Although some of the music from Cats is pretty infectious.
Yeah, there's
The
a
music,
few,
the
a
music,
few numbers.
no thanks. But I occasionally hear myself singing Mr. Mistopheles. Mr. Mistopheles. I really do. I have to confess that.
Yeah, yeah. See, for me, Andrew Lloyd Webber, I love Sunset Boulevard. I think
Yeah.
I think that was the one that hit it for me. And Phantom, there's numbers I like, but
I
again,
love Evita. Evita is
oh yes,
I love
that
Evita, and I
score.
love Jesus Christ Superstar.
Yes. I mean, there's so many musicals I love. I think that's why we're here right now. But again, there's something for everyone out there. I believe that. And Stacy, I can't wait to have you back again. So it sounds like you have something coming out. Anything else you want to publicize here? This is your time. If there's anything else you're working on.
I am working on, well, let's see, what's going to come out soon. I co-wrote with my dear friend and colleague Deborah Paredes an article about women duets in 1950s and 60s television shows. Broadway performers who sang duets together, which now I can't remember because we wrote it so long ago. But that's coming out in a book about musicals on TV. And an article actually that I co-wrote with one of my former students who graduated, about the musical Waitress and all female creative teams on Broadway, is coming out in a book that's a new history of musical theater. So I have things coming out, and then this Cinderella thing that we're still working on. So it's not out yet, but it will be in a book about Rodgers and Hammerstein, a new book about Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Ooh, okay. Well, I'm gonna have you back. We're gonna talk about
I would
movie
love it.
musicals and Rodgers and Hammerstein.
Let's do it.
Well,
Let's do
thank
it.
you, Stacy.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Andrew, so much. It's really been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for having me on.
Of course, of course. And everyone out there, get your hands on Changed for Good, Beyond Broadway. Look up Stacy Wolf. She has an amazing Princeton account in our show notes. Everything is in our show notes. So just click all the links for Stacy. Okay. Thank you, Stacy.
Thank you, Andrew.
Let's put our favorite musical number on now.
Yes.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Now, is that a Broadway musical encyclopedia type episode or what? I absolutely loved chatting with Stacy Wolf. Thank you, Stacy. And this is not the last Broadway musical discussion. I'll have Stacy back on the podcast. We have Jesse Green, the chief theater critic of the New York Times, back here. He's going to be giving us some Mary Rodgers insider knowledge. So Rodgers and Hammerstein are back again in the conversation of some Once Upon a Mattress discussion. So look out for that in November, because it's going to premiere around when Once Upon a Mattress opened on Broadway. So you can all Google search that now if you want to figure out when the episode is coming out. Okay, so I want to let you all know we have a Patreon, patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. It's called the Ivory Tower Boiler Room Cafe. You get unedited videos. So you'll see my video with Stacy. If you go on there right now, you join at $5 a month, which is less than an iced coffee in many coffee shops, especially in the Northeast. And you'll also get Mary's True Crime and Academia bonus episode. She has a full discussion about JonBenet Ramsey, the Charles Lindbergh baby kidnapping, and so much more. I have unedited videos up there. So even my discussion with Stacy, there's some things that, I can't put in the full audio episode because it'll be too long. So you get all of that content. And look out soon. There's going to be a full video episode recapping and dissecting the Marilyn Monroe film Blonde, which is on Netflix. If you haven't seen it yet, watch it so you're ready for the episode. I'm going to release part of it on our audio podcast, and then I will release the full episode as a video on Patreon. So again, get in early, patreon.com/Ivory Tower Boiler Room. Okay, also follow us on TikTok and Instagram and Twitter and Facebook. Thank you to our fall interns. They are so creative. I really love having you all on our podcast team. Thank you to Mary. Thank you to Kim. Bye, everyone out there. And here is from the 1997 Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella. There we go. Here is the end credits from the Brandy and Whitney Houston Cinderella.